If you're running for office in America, there's one thing you're not supposed to say out loud.
Taxes will go up.
Yes, Walter Mondale said it anyways. And he said it while running for the highest office in the country. Later on, he didn't walk it back. As a matter of fact, he doubled down on it in a debate with Ronald Reagan.
Mr. Reagan will raise taxes, and so will I. He won't tell you. I just did.
Why did he say that? And where did this honesty come from? This episode of 200 Norwegians is about Walter Mondale, the Norwegian-American who lost by a landslide, but still changed America in ways many are not aware of. This podcast wouldn't be possible without the support of key Norwegian-American institutions, such as Vesterheim and Norway House in San Francisco. But they're not the only ones. The Norwegian-American Historical Association and archivist Christina Warner have also done a tremendous job. For this episode, Warner dug up an almost 30-year-old interview that historian Odd Løvold conducted with Walter Mondale.
Press down both the record and the play.
That's what we did.
Time.
But she's on now. That's what we want. Okay, you got her on.
Oh, and she was able to do it.
Well, he just did what we did. I don't know. Maybe he's blessed.
Yeah, probably so. And the light is on. All right. Again, I'll take 30. Yeah, we can just go. Would you state your name, Mr. Mandel? So I have that.
Yeah, I'm Walter Mondale.
And you were born when?
January 5, 1928, a little town of Salon, Minnesota.
Uh-huh. Tell us a little bit about country tribe, but growing up.
Well, my dad was a minister, and my father was a musician.
Mm-hmm.
Mondale was Norwegian through his father's side, and although he was several generations removed from the original immigration, he remained deeply connected to his Norwegian heritage.
The family came from Norway with the name of Mundal, M-U-N-D-A-L, from a little town of the same name
You know, in the right.
in Fjærland. It is you go to Balestrand
Mm-hmm.
on the fjord, and then you go north on the Fjærland fjord, and just at the end of the fjord, a spectacularly beautiful fjord. It opens out into this huge, it is cephalic.
Mhm.
And on one side of it is the Mundal.
Mondale visited Norway and Mundal a number of times, most famously in 1979, when he was vice president.
I don't know many of you, but all of your faces look familiar.
Mondale's grandfather was the last in his family to be born and raised in Norway. He was part of one of the early waves of emigration at a time when families often traveled together.
It was fairly early, 1857,
Yes.
when they came. So my great-grandfather and mother came with, I think, 3 boys.
Mm-hmm.
And then they typical Norwegian route. They went to Fox River, Illinois,
Oh, yes.
and then they finally ended up as among the first white settlers in the little town of Bryceland, which is a Norwegian community outside of Albert Lea.
Oh, yeah.
And my great-grandfather, I guess, got $300, and he went into the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
And I found his papers when I was vice president. He signed with an X. So they called him Peters. Apparently he wasn't a man of English letters, yeah.
No, or he couldn't sign to him.
I think that was it. So they just put an X, and he served in the Civil War.
Yes.
And then he came back, and of course, those people got, what's it called, a patent.
Mm-hmm.
for their service, and he got his 80 acres or whatever it was and began farming in Bryceland. He had 3 sons, I think, and a daughter. And early, one of his sons was my granddaughter. And he was a farmer in Bryceland, I think his whole life.
Mondale came of age in the 1930s, at the time when Norwegians weren't supposed to speak Norwegian or act Norwegian. They were expected to blend in and become Americans. But his father did hold on to a few things.
Was there any Norwegian traditions in your home besides the Norwegian language that?
Well, yeah, he would tell us about growing up in this Norwegian community.
Mhm.
He would try to feed us lutefisk.
How did that?
In indifferent success. And I think the Norwegian influence came in my life was his heavy emphasis on honesty.
Mm-hmm.
That was just not a casual thing in our house.
No.
In the interview with Løvold, he emphasized several times that his dad was a strong believer in education.
He didn't care about money.
No.
But he did care about education.
In his autobiography, The Good Fight, Mondale touches on the themes of education and poverty. In one passage, he writes that his father lost the family farm during the land crash of the 1920s, and even though he went on to serve in a series of small but successful ministries, the family never had much. Still, his parents tried to expose the kids to the wider world. In the summer of 1938, his father built a makeshift camper out of plywood and took the family on a road trip to Washington, D.C. While they were there, they visited Henrik Schibsted. Schibsted had recently transitioned from the Labour Party to the Republican Party. While they were there, they visited the Congressman Henrik Schibsted. Schibsted had recently transitioned from the Farmers' Labour's Party to the Republican Party.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, he wanted us to see
Yes.
government in Washington. And we went there, and Henrik Shipston took us to lunch.
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Interesting.
And my dad gave him hell for
Really?
leaving the farmer labor.
He was courageous.
So I'll bet you he was sorry he spent the money on the spaghetti.
These people. Uh-huh. But it is interesting. I know something about your own political philosophy as you had expressed it, public addresses and so forth. Do you see any of that as your Norwegian heritage or as your father
I
specifically?
think so.
Yeah.
I think so. I've often talked to other people in public life, and most of them say the same thing I do. That you got your start and your moorings, your foundation when you were young.
Exactly.
And while you might change, you might even radically change, depending on circumstances, most of us can trace who we are and what we're up to, how we got started, and what our parents did for us.
Yes.
According to Mondale, it was also his father who gave him the political bug.
But what made you decide to go into public service?
I think I decided when I was in high school.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it was I was close to my father, and I knew how important this was to him. Not politics, but the social gospel and the progressive idea.
But as much as his father sparked the interest, there was another person who shaped it further and became something of a lifelong mentor. I am talking about Hubert Humphrey, the Minnesota governor and later presidential candidate, who, by the way, also happens to be a Norwegian American. In his memoir, Mondale describes Humphrey as a transformative figure.
Did he always have such a bubbly personality?
Oh,
Influence?
oh my gosh.
I mean, I never met him, but I heard
Yeah.
him speak
Oh, yeah.
several times and was present, but I never shook his hand.
He was always enthusiastic, optimistic, and eloquent. And when he was young and strong, it is almost irrepressible.
Yes, that's how he comes across.
Oh, yes.
So he's not really the typical stoic Norwegian. I mean, because
No. You know, his I guess his mother was Norwegian.
yeah, that's right.
But no, he got some kind of different gene there. He just very go-leather said he could speak 240 words a minute with gusts up to 400.
Hubert Humphrey was a reform-minded force in the Democratic Farmer-Labor Party. This was Minnesota's unique merger of the Democratic Party and the Farmer-Labor Party. It was created in 1944 to unite urban workers and rural farmers under one political banner against the Republicans.
There was a kind of a Minnesota revolution going on. The Democrats, Farmer Labor Party, were split, and they had been decimated in the 38 election.
Yeah, right.
The Republicans had it all, and the Democrats were very, very weak. The Democratic Farmer, they were separate parties.
Yeah.
So in 1944, Humphrey engineered the merger of the Democratic Farmer because he couldn't. If you kept splitting, you always lose. Republicans loved that because Republicans would win as a plurality, not a majority.
Exactly.
So they put those together, and then Humphrey led it. Okay, so that was about the time I was coming I graduated from high school in 46.
Yes.
I came up to McAllister, and I was hot to go.
Yes.
And I worked to peddle literature, all the things, as active in student politics, all the things you do when you're young and you want to get around. And then I went over to here. My political science professor, Dorothy Jacobson, took me over to hear Humphrey a couple of times. And then I tried to help any way I could. And my first big move was in the 48 election when I managed Truman's and Humphrey's campaign down in southern Minnesota, where I grew up.
Yeah, wonderful. And that was successful. So that.
Oh boy!
Yeah, that project.
We had for Truman as well as Humphrey.
Yes, he's the other.
After the 1948 election, Mondale felt he needed to reconsider his own prospects. His father had passed away, and he could no longer afford tuition at McAllister. So he dropped out and completed his degree at the University of Minnesota. He then joined the Army and served for 2 years at Fort Knox before returning to the Twin Cities to enroll in law school at the University of Minnesota on the GI Bill.
And I went through law school, became a lawyer, attorney general, and the rest is history, as you say.
Yeah, right.
Yes, it's history, but it's also a pretty remarkable piece of history. Mondale actually became the youngest attorney general ever in Minnesota up to that point. And once again, Hubert Humphrey was part of the story. In 1958, Humphrey had just won a seat in the U.S. Senate. That set off a chain reaction, and the sitting attorney general moved on to a different position. And suddenly, there was an opening for Mondale. Mondale was ready for it. He was considered disciplined, thoughtful, and reform-minded. He expanded consumer protection laws. He took on corporate abuses, and he strengthened civil rights enforcement. And what he shaped in those years would harden into something more lasting: his political doctrine, the Mondale doctrine, if you like.
And your philosophy would be that the government needs to help those who cannot help themselves. I mean, we're not all self-made people. I mean,
Well, I often argue to the astonishment of some of my more conservative friends that I'm more conservative than they are.
really, it tell me how.
Because I think the indispensable ingredient to stability and to the sanctity of property and to the obedience of the law and to the strength of our nation, which of course is the most precious thing we share as a
Yes,
country,
of course.
lies in a sense to be found in most people that they have a stake in the country, that it offers a fair chance to achieve, that the rules are fair, and that for those who will try, if you play by the rules, your chances of a decent life are pretty good, or at least everybody would be trying to make it pretty good. There's not that you're guaranteed a result.
No.
But I think that is the most stabilizing, that and the idea of freedom, democracy, openness, fair rule, is the most significant stabilizing conservative force in a society.
As we now get into the nitty-gritty of Mondale's politics, you'll hear from someone who knows both the man and his ideas better than almost anyone alive, Larry Jacobs. From the early 2000s, Mondale works in academia, and Jacobs taught alongside him for 16 years at the Hubert Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota.
He was a very humble person. He was a very, very decent person. I've been around lots of politicians. There was no one like Walter Mondale.
And there wasn't really anything like the class they taught together either, which became very popular.
We had hundreds of students in it. And it became kind of a signature course at the university. And over the course of our 16 years teaching together, thousands and thousands of students took it. Many people from the community heard about the class. They registered to audit what's known as auditing it. And people took pride in taking this course and being with Walter Mondale.
But let's go back to Mondale's early political years, namely the 1960s.
Mondale was the youngest attorney general appointed in the early 1960s. When Humphrey became vice president to Lyndon Johnson in 1964, Mondale, ran and served in Hubert Humphrey's U.S. Senate seat. And, the circle in the Senate that Mondale was part of were very much kind of the Humphrey camp. So Humphrey paved the way for Walter Mondale.
Mondale spent a total of 12 years in the U.S. Senate, from 1964 to 1976. According to Jacobs, he was highly effective during his time there.
You could talk about Mondale's big achievements, and let me just tick through a few of them. He was very important in passing what became the foundation of America's government healthcare system. It's known as Medicare. It's a program that provides healthcare for seniors. And Mondale was a key part of passing that after Lyndon Johnson was reelected in 1964. Mondale was a key part of the civil rights legislation. Now, there were a bunch of Democrats and Republicans who supported civil rights legislation. Mr. Mondale took on and became the sponsor and responsible for a critical part of the civil rights legislation. It's known as the Fair Housing Act. And before Mondale, it was very common for neighborhoods to be segregated. You could think of the Deep South where it was explicit, but even in the North, it was very common. And you would have, for instance, banks not being willing to provide mortgages to Black families in areas that were predominantly white. And so Mondale went in and started to ask questions. And he went in and talked to the chief Democrat in the Senate and said, I want to take on housing. And, the leader shook his head and said, there's really not support for that. He said, well, let me see what I can do with it. So Mondale came back and told his staff what he was going to do. And all the staff knew this was a losing issue. And I've heard this from several people. They all uniformly just shook their head and said, oh, boss, what have you done? Because they figured this was going to be a fool's errand. Well, Mondale spent a lot of time building a coalition. And in part, what he did was he brought in to his committee service members who had served in World War II, Korea, and had started to serve in Vietnam, who were African American. And one after another, they talked about how they'd served their country. They came home, they were not allowed to buy a house that was a nice house in a nice neighborhood because of their color of their skin. And eventually he kind of built this coalition. It was a very, very difficult debate because you can imagine when you're talking about desegregation, particularly involving the government, it's about as personal as you can get. You're telling people we want to have the government come in and tell you who can be your neighbors. And so the pushback was very, very intense. And it became a kind of a lightning rod issue. Legislation passed very narrowly. And it today is the only piece of civil rights legislation regarding housing. Mondale knew at the time that it had great limitations. It still has limitations, but it is the stepping stone for the work that has been done on fair housing. And Mondale has been recognized by many civil rights leaders and organizations for that.
Still, the most memorable part of Mondale's career came after 1976. 1976 was the year Jimmy Carter secured the Democratic nomination, and once he had it, he began looking for a running mate.
And he's interviewing, a number of Democrats as possible vice presidential candidates. And the process they set up is that you'd get contacted by the Carter team, and then you'd be invited down to Carter's hometown in Plains, Georgia. And Mondale went down, and Carter realized he had a connection with Mondale. They were both sons of preachers. They were both people devoted to education. They both had a kind of a more humble approach to politics. Carter appreciated that Mondale knew Washington well, and Carter was an outsider. So there was they complement each other that way. And so eventually Carter said to Mondale, look, I'd like you to consider serving as my vice president. So Mondale went and talked to his mentor, Hubert Humphrey, and said, I saw what Lyndon Johnson did to you. And Lyndon Johnson had humiliated Hubert Humphrey in many ways. And this is famous and it's been recorded. And Mondale said, I've been offered this. I'm honored by it, but I have a lot of reservations because of what happened to you, because you were diminished by this. And Hubert Humphrey shook his head and said, no, it was a great honor. I got to see the country and the world in a unique way. I don't think you should dismiss this, but what you might want to do is consider ways that it would fit you. And so Mondale went back, and with his staff, they came up with Jimmy Carter on a series of kind of changes they were going to make in the White House so that the vice president was no longer, as they had been, standby. And this is the way they referred to, president is shot and killed. Who becomes president? Well, you bring the vice president in. But they had nothing to do with governing. They were literally outside. And the presidents liked it that way because often the vice president was the next political figure who would be challenging them, and they saw them as a political rival. With Carter and Mondale created what is the modern vice presidency, which is an integral part of government. They play a vital role in the deliberations. They play a vital role in terms of the operation of the internal government. They play a vital role in terms of foreign policy, meeting with diplomats and countries. Um, and Mondale did all that. And there were several key parts of it. One is that the vice president's office is no longer outside the White House. There's the white building everyone knows. Next to it is an office building called the Old Executive Office. And that's where the vice president had been parked for a long time, forever, or as long as that building had been there. And Mondale said, you might as well be across the Potomac. In other words, outside of Washington, if you were in the Old Executive Office building, because you were not part of the center of power. And so Mondale and his staff said, look, you've got to be in the Oval Office close to the president's office. And Carter said, yeah, that seems reasonable. I want that. I want you to be someone I can talk to all the time. And Mondale said, okay, well, I think we ought to be meeting regularly. We ought to set aside a time for us to meet regularly. And so they set aside this, weekly lunch, which they did, routinely. And Mondale and his staff said, I need to know what's going on. And so they created a process where the paper going through the White House, the Oval Office, was also going through the vice president's office. Now, as you know, information is power. So when I say he became part of the flow of every document going through the White House, whether it's from the CIA or the FBI or from Congress, that was a huge step. And Mondale's staff were integrated into the White House staff. So you can see in a lot of different ways, Mr. Mondale kind of stitched in the vice presidency into the presidency. And to this day, that is the model.
Jimmy Carter lost the election in 1980. 4 years later, in 1984, another election came around. And this time, Walter Mondale was the Democratic nominee. Ronald Reagan was 73 at the time, and many doubted his capacity. But in a televised debate, Reagan cleverly turned that concern to his advantage.
I want to raise an issue that I think has been lurking out there for 2 or 3 weeks and cast it specifically in national security terms. You already are the oldest president in history, and some of your staff say you were tired after your most recent encounter with Mr. Mondale. I recall yet that President Kennedy had to go for days on end with very little sleep during the Cuba Missile Crisis. Is there any doubt in your mind that you would be able to function in such circumstances?
Not at all, Mr. Truitt, and I want you to know that also I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
Walter Mondale had no comeback, and he later said that this exact moment was the moment where he realized he would lose. Was he too mild-mannered for his political era?
Mr. Mondale was respectful. He was someone who believed in America. He certainly was loyal to the Democratic Party, but his first loyalty was to the country. So, no, I think it'd be wrong to say that he was mild-mannered. He was an intense person, but he was intense and committed and, ambitious, but it wasn't unbounded. He had other, other commitments. If you go back and you look at the 1984 campaign, look at that first debate. The first debate, Walter Mondale wiped the floor of Ronald Reagan.
Well, I guess I'm reminded a little bit of what Will Rogers once said about Hoover. He said, it's not what he doesn't know that bothers me, it's what he knows for sure. It just ain't so. The fact of it is, the president's budget sought to cut Social Security by 25%. It's not an opinion, it's a fact.
It was a disaster for Ronald Reagan, and many Republicans thought that Reagan might lose because Mondale had so overperformed him. It was in the second debate where Ronald Reagan was able to get loose a few quips that kind of showed that he had some level of acuity, even though we now know that he was starting to have cognitive problems. But Mondale was not a pushover. He was fighting hard. And, here's an example of this. And this is a shocking example for those in politics. Walter Mondale, when he accepted the nomination of the Democratic Party, he gave a speech. You need to get the exact language of this. In the speech, he did something I've never seen a politician do, certainly not a Democratic politician. He said, Ronald Reagan is running on cutting taxes. He won't be able to do that because it's going to explode the deficit. And he's building up the defense. He said, for the things I believe in, I would raise taxes. He wouldn't tell you, I just told you. And this was an extraordinary moment of courage and hard hitting. It would, Ronald Reagan would kind of pound him on it as the campaign went on. And I think in hindsight, people who study elections view that election as probably more of a reflection of these kind of broader structural issues, particularly the fact the economy was recovering, that really boosted Ronald Reagan. But in terms of the power of what Mondale was doing, both in the debate and his remarkable courage in stepping forward and being honest about what he was going to do. By the way, Ronald Reagan raised taxes 5 times. What Walter Mondale said Ronald Reagan would do, he did. Walter Mondale was telling the truth. Ronald Reagan wasn't. Mondale obviously lost the 1984 election. He lost by quite a bit. He gave a concession speech. And he came out to his supporters, many of whom were weeping because they were strong supporters and they feared what Ronald Reagan would do, what he did do. He said, I just talked to the president. I congratulated him on a hard campaign and told him that I would do whatever I could to support him. The crowd started to boo. He held up his hands and said,
He is one. We are all Americans. He is our president, and we honor him tonight.
That wasn't Mondale. Mondale was he was such a high character person.
Why do you think he did lose? What was the most important reason that the time wasn't on his side, or how would you, in hindsight, analyze that loss?
This is actually a very easy question to answer as a political scientist who studies elections. The economy had grown significantly. Inflation was down. Jobs were up. Now, you take those 3 facts, you put them into an equation, and they predict every election since World War II. When you got an incumbent who's got a favorable economy, and as a result, favorable approval ratings, they win.
But again, Walter Mondale was more than his final loss. After 1984, he returned to Minnesota. He practiced law, taught public affairs at the University of Minnesota, and later served as a U.S. ambassador to Japan. He never compromised on his integrity, and he never fell into the pull of political polarization. He continued to root for his country, even when his own party didn't win.
When Donald Trump was elected in 2016, he came into the White House in 2017. His vice president, Pence, calls up Mr. Mondale for advice. Now, you could imagine Donald Trump and Walter Mondale. I can't think of 2 people who are less like each other. But Pence came to understand that Mondale was the pioneer of this office, and he needed guidance about how to use that power, things to avoid. I have to tell you, I asked Mr. Mondale, as you can imagine, for some details about that. I said, what'd you talk about? And he gave me the general outline. But when I pressed further, he looked at me, shook his head and said, Larry, that was a confidential call. My comments were in confidence to the Vice President of the United States. No, We're not going to talk about that. That's Walter Mondale.
My name is Frederick Kalstveit, and this podcast was made in conjunction with Vesterheim and with the support from Norway House Foundation in San Francisco. A special thank to the Norwegian-American Historical Association and Christina Warner for helping me out with this episode. The music you hear in the background was made by Jan Skoglund.